Luigi Mangione stands accused of the murder of United Healthcare boss Brian Thompson. But rather than condemn the killing, the public, at least large parts of it, seem to be saving their sympathy for the killer, with many people from across the political spectrum using this line of reasoning. I do believe he killed one person, but the CEO has corporately killed thousands. Now, that was a message received by one of our colleagues from her Lib Dem voting mum. So the way people, including, very centrist, very, moderate so-called people, are understanding these events have spread far and wide in the US. That's understandable. Mangione's actions appear to have tapped into a groundswell of anger directed at health insurance corporations. After all, 60% of American adults experience problems using their insurance, including denial of coverage for procedures, as well as failing to get reimbursements after care. But private health insurance ripoffs doesn't explain the phenomenon in other countries like the UK, where only a relatively small number of people use it. What does explain it, though, is an intuitive understanding of how corporations work and how their bosses and shareholders enrich themselves on our misery. While we were struggling through the cost of living crisis, corporations boosted their profits, making our lives harder, raking in record bottom lines. Corporations are also increasingly large landlords in the UK, raising rents, swallowing up residential properties at higher than ever prices, and presenting tenants with a faceless landlord, all again for shareholder value. And corporations are destroying our planet, stealing the air we breathe and the environments we inhabit, and charging us for the pleasure of doing so. Just 57 companies are responsible for 80% of greenhouse gas emissions. And in the 7 years since the Paris Accords, many have increased their fossil fuel use. Of course, the American private industry is uniquely homicidal, but people do understand how corporate greed works and how it only ever grows. Corporations are parasites. They extract off us constantly. They take and take and take until there's no more left to take. And they hand it to their bosses and their shareholders. And most people really get this. But there's a small constituency who just can't wrap their head around all this anti-corporate sentiment. You guessed it, it's the wealthy and their advocates, including an insulated media class who seem completely baffled by the public's outpouring of understanding for the killer of a CEO. This was an exchange on Luigi Mangione between Brianna Joy Gray and Piers Morgan on a recent episode of his YouTube show.
It looks to me like he's a bit of a narcissist.
What do you mean?
I think he was a narcissist. I think that he was clearly unhinged. I'm not sure that he's the great Robin Hood. Hang on.
Which guy? I'm sorry.
Hang on.
Luigi,
the shooter,
or,
right?
Brian Thompson.
The one who shot Brian Thompson, Luigi, right? I'm just not sure that he's this great, heroic guy standing up against the healthcare system. I suspect
I'm not talking about that. This isn't about Luigi, who may or may not, he's been arrested, he's been charged. We may or may not know that he's the actual shooter. I'm talking about the public reaction to Brian Thompson's death.
No, I understand that.
We do know about Brian Thompson.
I understand that.
We know about United Healthcare. And that's the root of the discontent. That's the root of the public outcry. Luigi is just a vessel through which people are expressing their deep frustrations with the American healthcare system. So the question is, if you don't want murders like this to be happening, assassinations to be happening like this in the street, and I'm someone who does not believe in the death penalty, and don't condone these kinds of vigilante instances of violence in either case. But if you want to get to the root of why people are so deeply unhappy, you have to, it resonates so deeply with people that this has happened, you have to get to the root of why there is this deep well of tragedy, despair, and outrage in the United States of America. And that has to do with what Brian Thompson has chosen to do with his life, and what companies like United Healthcare have chosen to do to the American people.
But just to be clear, before I go to Natalie to respond to that, do you feel any empathy for Brian Thompson and his family?
I have infinite empathy for any individual as a person in their personal capacity. As his role as the CEO of United Healthcare, I'm afraid I'm with the overwhelming majority, bipartisan majority of the American people who say, I'm saving my empathy for people who are much more vulnerable and have caused a lot less harm.
So to be clear, you don't have any empathy for him after he was executed?
I personally don't.
Right. Okay. Well, at least you're honest. I mean, I find this staggering. You've got to remember, the left is supposed to be the party that cares so much. All of them have their Be Kind hashtags. They're the caring ones, the kind ones, and they can't even bring it in their hearts to say they find a shred of empathy for a man who's just been executed, who's the father of children, the husband of a loving wife, and so on. I find that just staggering, that you can't, on a human level, have empathy for the murder of someone, but also make your point about the system in which he was an executive.
Now, one of the most striking things about the Mangione case is that it actually isn't a left-right thing. He isn't a leftist, and he appeared to quite like Silicon Valley tech bros. There are also plenty of people on the left, pacifists, for example, but others too, who would decry the killing. But many of the masses of people who are on the sharp edge of corporate greed every day are finding it hard to mourn the loss of an example of someone profiting from their misery. Someone else who got that wrong was conservative shock jock and reported multimillionaire Ben Shapiro. On a recent episode of his podcast entitled The Evil Revolutionary Left, Cheers Murder, Shapiro gave this explanation for the public reaction to Mangione.
Violence against members of private industry, that isn't even a protest of public policy. Let's be fair about this. That isn't even shooting politicians, which would be evil enough. It's even a different level of evil because it's a protest against the very system of free markets themselves. Brian Thompson isn't responsible for America's healthcare system any more than the head of CVS is responsible for America's trade system. Directing hatred against Brian Thompson is not about shaping public policy, because you could shoot every CEO in America and it wouldn't shape public policy. It turns out that it's about trying to threaten anyone who engages in free markets at all. This is simply Marxist, leftist, radical evil.
He really overestimates the organic love that people have for free market economies. It's just taken for granted that, of course, people would be horrified at the idea of taking a shot against a free market economy when, actually a lot of polling shows that when you actually ask people the nuts and bolts, whether they agree with the nuts and bolts of free market economics, a lot of the time people are like, actually no, and also it's not really a free market. Well, Shapiro's viewers didn't agree with the assessment that he had. I'm actually going to read you some of their comments. This one had 14,000 likes. He says, "You're wrong, Ben. I'm that evil leftist you always rage about. I have an uncle who is as conservative as they come, voted for Trump and everything. We have very little in common and avoid each other at holiday parties. I can tell you we both wept when my dad slowly died of cancer while the insurance he paid for kept denying him life-saving care. We both saw the injustice in that. That same uncle is posting on Facebook right now how he couldn't give a fuck about no CEO. Insurance companies kill millions of people a year and they don't discriminate between leftists and conservatives." This one also had 14,000 likes. "Fact, both left and right are cheering. We don't care about your feelings." And this commenter with 6,000 likes displayed a savvy understanding of how division profits the dividers. "Your business model requires us normal people to hate each other." Read the room, Ben. But it isn't just right-wing media that doesn't get public feeling in this case. Mainstream liberal media is panicking too.
The reaction online is also just such a reinforcement of how much aesthetics, attractiveness, the shallowness of the American people, the American people who are online, we'll say, is very much on display here. Yes, there's absolutely a bubbling anger about the inequity in the country writ large and in the healthcare system, no question. But so much of the clips we were watching at the top of this segment are driven by the fact that this is an attractive.
We got to drop the banner to show why.
And it is deeply troubling that we are celebrating this person who's committed cold-blooded murder because he clearly went to the gym.
I mean, America, Europe celebrate cold-blooded murderers all the time. And I'm not going to deny that the public, I am the public, have been pretty thirsty over Mangione. But trying to discount the public's genuine anti-corporate rage as them just having their head turned by a set of pecs is just another example of the kind of infantilizing, dismissive, and anti-political behavior that mainstream liberal media has come to exemplify. Stephen, this kind of anti-corporate sentiment, it cuts across so many different demographics, it cuts across political persuasions. Is this something that we can build something out of?
I think it is absolutely something that we can build something out of. And I'll tell you why. It's very useful, I think, to think about oneself from the point of view of a corporation. What am I to a corporation? Well, I'm nothing except a vehicle for extraction. First, there's the extraction of my labor and the value that's attached to it by the corporation, which is greater than the value I'm given for it, of course. Then there's all the things that I can buy or that I have to pay for that can be costed at higher and higher costs. And you'd think that the logic of capitalism, of corporate capitalism, would be don't kill the organisms that you're extracting all this value from. Except capitalism has no logic and it is killing us. The epitome case is the American private health insurance case where, yeah, it happily kills its patients. It denies them treatment, it takes the money, and then it doesn't give them what would keep them going on for longer in order to give them more money. But as you pointed out in that piece, the environment is another way in which corporate greed is killing us. And I think people do understand that. They do understand when they are squeezed too far. Even if they don't have a theory of why it is, they do understand that actually the squeeze is too tight, you can't breathe, you can't go on, you have nothing left at the end of the month, and you're not getting anything in return. And I think what they also realize is that our politicians are not going to protect us from this. Whether you are a Labour voter or a Conservative voter, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, you know that when it comes to corporations, which are extra political, they're international, they have incredible power, some of them greater power than many states, you know that neither of those parties are going to do anything to defend you from them. Our own Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, has been sucking up to BlackRock recently, which is, an asset grabbing corporation, very, very interested in the assets that Britain has that we, the people, have paid into over lifetimes. So, yeah, I think there is a broad understanding that corporations are not good for you. In fact, they want to kill you, or they are killing you, and that our politicians, no matter where they stand on the political spectrum, are not going to protect us from them. And that's why people are sort of supportive or refusing to condemn Mangioni's actions, because they're in a position where they think, well, what other actions are there to take against corporate power if the people that we vote into power aren't going to use the power that we give them via elections to protect us? Now, on the left-right divide, and as we saw, as we've seen, that's understood by people no matter how they vote. Working class people, lower middle class people across the political divide understand that life is getting worse for them as corporations grow richer and richer. Now, of course, how you theorize that is a matter of whether you're on the left or you're on the right. From my own point of view, I feel like the left has done decades, centuries even, of work on capitalism. But you only have to look at two books that came out in the earliest 20th century, which talk explicitly about how corporations impinge on our lives, suck us dry domestically, and how they also take advantage of geopolitical disaster in order to enrich themselves as well. And those are both books by Naomi Klein. No Logo in the early 2000s, a little bit later, The Shock Doctrine. So that's, I guess, where I would theorize this from. But it's perfectly legitimate to just think, oh, I'm being ripped off. My paycheck doesn't go as far as it does. I've had to watch in the case of private health insurance, I've had to watch a family member die. In the case of the cost of living, I can't afford groceries anymore. My rent is spiraling out of control. Utilities are overpriced, and I see newspaper headlines telling me that the bottom lines of these companies just get fatter and fatter as I get thinner and thinner. So that disquiet, that anger, that sense of being ripped off, being taken for granted, being treated like an idiot by corporate capital, that really is the basis, I think, for a broad movement against corporatism, a broad movement that can influence politics, that can lead politicians in the direction that broad movement wants to move in, and that can eventually tackle corporate greed, restrict it in some way. Because, at the moment, we are heading towards a Blade Runner situation where elites are living in the sky and we're living in the dirt. And I think that is what people know in their hearts.
Yeah, I think that identifying anti-corporate sentiment as a thread through the political consciousness that people are developing, either as a sort of ideological framework of, socialism or whatever, or just as a keenly felt awareness that they experience on a daily basis is going to be core to any radical politics moving forward, for any progressive movement, for any leftist movement that's going to be successful and to gain a broad-based coalition. Because I really think that this sense of, people feel a sense that like everything that is important to us as human beings, how we eat, how we live together, how we communicate with one another, how we entertain ourselves, how we do everything, how our environment is shaped, is being made worse by corporate power. It's being cannibalized by corporate power. And for so long, particularly, in the 90s and in the early noughties, there's been this propaganda attempt to rename corporates as, wealth creators or job creators and all of these kinds of things. And that just is so out of touch with how everyday people experience corporate influence in their life, how the corporatization of the environment, corporatization of housing, of food, of all of these things. And I think the fact that people are responding to this with this sense of, yes, something has to change, tells me that the imagination that things can be different and the ways in which, the elites have tried to sell free market corporate capitalism as an inevitable, as a natural state of affairs, as, an unmovable state of affairs, that despite that being a really concerted propaganda campaign for years, that has actually not succeeded. And people do have a keen sense of there's actually a different way of organizing this that's not centered around the shareholders of a couple of corporations. But, I think there is a lot of potential there. And I don't think that we could have even predicted that this would be the response. And obviously, the fact that he's good looking or whatever, it kind of adds to like the memeability of the whole thing. But on a fundamental level, I don't think you could find a single person in the US who would say corporate healthcare worked for me. I remember one thing I remember seeing a while ago was an invoice, an itemized invoice from a woman who had given birth in an American hospital. And they had charged her for skin-to-skin contact. Like they had charged her for the act of being able to put her baby on her body and have skin-to-skin contact right after it was born. Like that was a commodified act. I mean, I don't think anyone in their right mind, no one other than someone who directly makes profit from that state of affairs, thinks that that is a sane way to organize society. There's just no way. And I think if we can, and the anti-globalization movements, which Naomi Klein's work did really influence and emerge out of, really had a good go at trying to create a politics around that. And maybe now it's time to kind of bring some of that back, because maybe now corporatization has, people have seen enough of corporatization that those arguments could really resonate quite strongly.